I want Christians to think about three issues. And as you think about these, let's just understand that all three of them are at stake in every election. Number one, person. Number two, policy. Number three, party. And all of this is, of course, related because you're voting for one candidate. You're voting for one party, for one ticket when it comes to a presidential election. You can't separate party and policy and person. But at least in terms of moral analysis, we need to separate those things. Person. I have spoken to the issue of person. Personal integrity is absolutely important. But we also recognize that we are not electing choir boys as president of the United States. And we just need some honest presidential history here, even honest presidential history about the background of Joe Biden. And just to understand, we are looking at very conflicted persons who've been involved in everything from plagiarism to questionable readings of the Constitution. You go down the list, and this doesn't even get to issues like abortion, which we're going to get to. So I want to be clear. I'm putting person on that list, but there are two other words on that list. The second one is policy. What would this candidate do if elected? And in this case, you have dramatic differences between, first of all, any Democrat who could get the Democratic nomination these days and Donald Trump, or any Republican who could get the nomination. Now, on issues like policy, I want to come back and say that would include foreign policy, defense policy, it would include economic policy, fiscal policy, taxation policy, education policy, and of course, policies related to an entire range of issues, including abortion, sexuality. You just go down the list, human dignity, religious liberty. And when it comes to the policy side, I don't believe the Republicans are in perfect shape. As a matter of fact, I think the Republican platform adopted before Donald Trump is superior to the one adopted by him, certainly on the question of abortion. On the other hand, I also understand the distinction just on the issue of abortion between the Democrat, and in this case, it's not just Kamala Harris, the vice president of the United States, who ran on a radical pro-abortion position. And even though she's talking now, insofar as she's talking at all openly about details, she's speaking as if she wants to continue what the Biden administration called the legislation of Roe. As I said, that's intellectually dishonest. That's not going to happen. And just to make that point clear, Tim Walz, the governor of Minnesota, chosen as her running mate, is an absolute radical on the issue of abortion. And that's another very clear indication of where Kamala Harris is. And when it comes to policy, even on the issue of abortion, especially on the issue of abortion, there's still light years difference between the Democratic and the Republican parties on this, between Vice President Harris and former President Trump on this question. And you also have, of course, an entire operation behind them. I mean the executive branch, but I also mean the party. So the three words person, policy, and party. Where are the three parties on this issue? No one has been able to run on a Democratic ticket who wasn't pro-abortion in some sense for most of my lifetime. And yet you look at this and you recognize now we are talking about something that's unprecedented. In effect, Joe Biden has been the most pro-abortion president in American history. But when it comes to Kamala Harris, she is even more radical and has been through the entirety of her political career. And she just chose as a running mate someone who is radical beyond that. And you have the arguments of the entire party. And this is where I want to remind Christians that when we think about an election, we're not just electing a candidate, we're electing a government. That's the way it works. Now, there are a lot of permanent employees, there are a lot of permanent treaties, permanent legislative realities, but the larger reality is that we have turned the presidency in this country into a form of government in such a sense that when you elect a president, you're electing policies, you're electing a person. Yes, but you're electing an entire party apparatus that is, whether they're honest or not on both sides, ready to seize the opportunity to run with their party's ambitions as far as possible. Evangelical Christians have also not arrived as novices at asking this question. Back in 1972, the late Ron Sider formed an organization known as Evangelicals for McGovern. It was the first time such an entity had been organized among American evangelicals, and clearly it was an uphill battle, and clearly they lost that battle. Most evangelicals voted overwhelmingly for Richard Nixon, not for George McGovern, and I would say for good reason. But there's been an evangelical left pointing in this direction for a very long time. After Evangelicals for McGovern, you can go down the list. And that would include even, you could say very classically, the evangelical support for Bill Clinton, who was even more open in terms of a pro-abortion position than George McGovern was in 1972. By the time you had Bill Clinton come along in 1992, elected president for 2 terms, you see a major change in the Democratic Party, and that meant it was a change all the way down. For decades now, it's virtually incomprehensible that a pro-life candidate could even appear at the Democratic National Convention. Test me on that. But I not only have to point to person and policy and party, I need to point to two other issues. Number one, the effect of our vote. So what will be the effect of your vote? If you are qualified to vote in the presidential election, if you vote, that vote is going to have some kind of impact. Now, some listeners are in my situation. You're in a state which is going to go overwhelmingly in one direction. Mine's red, another will be blue. But the reality is your vote still matters. Your vote is an act of conscience. Your vote is a revelation of conviction. Your vote is an image of character. It is very clearly your vote. And that means that when we take responsibility to vote, we understand we're not able to elect a perfect candidate, nowhere near. And that doesn't mean they're all the same either. There are some qualitative issues there, certainly to be considered. But we're electing a government, and we're electing policy, and we're electing a party as the organizing logic of that government, and that makes a huge difference. There is no way out, and that is the second issue. The effect of our vote is that if we don't vote, or if we vote for an implausible candidate, that is to say, some third-party candidate, we write someone in, and I'm not saying that would not be an act of conscience. I am saying that conscience needs to be informed by the fact that you are overweighting the rest of the vote. And that is to say, there's no way out of this. And so it is a way of registering a certain act of conscience, but there are balancing issues to that conscience. And those balancing issues to me are radically underlined on the issues of policy and party. I believe that not voting for one of the two parties means your vote is simply a matter of an extraneous choice that may function as a way that is right for your conscience, but I want that conscience to be informed by the fact that that vote nonetheless is not going to be without responsibility for the impact of the election. So I can tell you what I think, and I can tell you what I think this means. I think that, like in 1972, the vast majority of American evangelical Christians, and it's not just that, the vast majority of those are regular church attenders and are deeply committed to a theistic worldview. I believe the vast majority will be likely to vote for Donald Trump because they're voting for the Republican Party, because they are voting for those policies. And that's not without concern about some of those policies. It is just to say, that concern is certainly clarified when you look at the actual policies which are represented by, and I will go so far as to say threatened by, the likes of Kamala Harris and Tim Walz. So I believe there will be some evangelical Christians and other conservatives who will write in a name as a presidential candidate as an act of conscience, believing themselves to be unable to vote, even though they would hold to some kind of conservative principles. They are unable by conscience to vote for Donald Trump. I want to say that the rest of us will have to respect that. But I'm going to say I do not endorse that. And I believe that our vote will have consequences, and particularly in this kind of election, and we are electing policies, and we are, in effect, electing a party, and there still is a dramatic difference when it comes down to the policies that will be enacted by these two different candidates for president as you look at the Democratic and the Republican tickets.